Hello. Today I'd like to talk to you about Russia, China, and the new space race. Before I begin, let me give you some of the terms I'm going to mention. I'll refer to the Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin. I shall also talk about the International Space Station. I'll be mentioning the invasion of Crimea and the militarization of space. And another term that will come up will be the word projectile. I'm going to start my speech now. Ladies and gentlemen, it's now over 60 years since mankind first ventured into space. In April 1961, Russia achieved the historic feat of sending the first man into space. The cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin was sent into orbit. He circled the planet and then returned to Earth. The 1960s, of course, was the era of the Cold War, a rivalry between the two great powers of the time, the Soviet Union and the United States. And this rivalry was reflected in what became known as the space race. The two nations competed throughout the 1960s, and of course, in 1969, the Americans put the first man on the moon. Space exploration has continued ever since, largely on the part of the United States and Russia, but they have actually joined forces. For instance, they've been working together on the International Space Station, which was launched in 1998. Indeed, for the last decade, American astronauts have been transported to the International Space Station using Russian rockets. However, the International Space Station is now coming to the end of its lifespan and is due to be decommissioned in 2028. Now, there may well be a new space station to replace it, but the context of space exploration is now undergoing considerable upheavals. It seems that the United States and Russia are now being joined by a third major power in space, namely China. So now there is a new space race. On the one hand, we have the United States, and on the other, its two rivals, Russia and China, which are actually teaming up with each other. In 2014, Russia and China signed a friendship agreement. This agreement actually encompassed a number of areas, not just space exploration. For instance, it was designed to boost trade to increase commercial ties. And not only that, there was also an element concerned with energy. Russia, for instance, has been sending oil and gas to China through a pipeline. The fact that the agreement was signed in 2014 is no coincidence, ladies and gentlemen, because in that year, the Western powers, including the United States, imposed sanctions on Russia following its invasion of Crimea. The imposition of sanctions, however, had unintended consequences because it meant that the Russians decided to look for friends further to the east. Now, Russia and China do have much to gain in this new cooperation in space. After all, the Russians, as we've seen, have over 60 years' experience of working in space, and so they have a lot of technological expertise. The Chinese, on the other hand, lack that expertise, but they more than make up for it in cash. They have the money to fund expensive projects in space. In fact, in spring of 2021, Russia and China agreed that they would set about designing and building a base on the moon. Both nations claim that they are engaged in space exploration for peaceful purposes, but is that actually true? Well, of course, they would certainly both benefit from the technological developments associated with space exploration, but I fear that there is also another motivation. Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, it seems that the existing rivalry between major powers on Earth is now moving into space. In fact, China has quite clearly said that its goal is to become the dominant power in space. Well, how might it do that? What it's looking for is control over the rules which govern the various satellites in orbit around our planet. I don't have to tell you how important the role of satellites is in so many aspects of our lives, so I'm sure you'll recognize that this is pretty serious. And what the Chinese are looking for in particular is control over surveillance satellites, because it's that type of satellite that will allow them to monitor what people are doing on the ground. And there are other worrying developments, not just the issue of satellites. What we are seeing here could potentially lead to a militarization of space. And I'm really not being alarmist here. For example, in 2007, China launched a missile with the intent of destroying a satellite. And it's not just the Chinese who've been doing that sort of thing. In 2020, Russia launched a projectile from a satellite which was already orbiting in outer space. So all of these developments, I'm sure you'll agree, are rather worrying. But will the friendship between Russia and China endure? In the past, it has to be said that China and Russia have had a rather rocky relationship. After the Second World War, they did indeed cooperate as fellow communist states. But in the 1960s, they fell out with each other, and the disagreement was so serious that it actually led to a war on the border between Russia and China in 1969. I would also point out to you China's record when it comes to using other people's technology. Russia may well provide the technology to begin with, but then the Chinese will, no doubt, catch up on the technological front, and they may well decide that at that stage they don't need their Russian friends anymore. In any event, what is happening in space will certainly affect all of us in the coming decades. So to conclude, I would suggest that it's definitely worth keeping an eye on developments in this area. Thank you very much for your attention.